hate is inevitable for many of us, and that it is really unhelpful to pathologize inevitable emotions. And I would go further and say that for myself, I feel myself getting more. I've been political for many, many years, but I feel more and more political at the moment and over the last few years. And what for me has been a very radicalizing force is a kind of growing and glowing hatred for this system.
Hello and welcome to Downstream. I'm Ash Sarkar, and today I'm going to be talking to China Miéville, author of A Spectre Haunting, a new book on the Communist Manifesto, and also the brain behind The City in the City, Embassy Town, Perdido Street Station. We're going to talk about sadism, communism, and longing for something better than what we've got. Hope you enjoy. Welcome, China, to the Novara studio. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're here to talk about your new book, A Spectre Haunting, but I have a feeling that we are going to range a little bit outside of that terrain as well. But to kick us off, could you maybe tell us what communism is?
Oh, how long do we have? The book starts quite early on saying this is highly contested, so it would be ridiculous to say, well, here's the definition and now we all agree. But I think, broadly speaking, highly contested, including among its advocates, obviously. But I suppose...
No one fights like the left.
Yeah, well, quite. But I think, at a very, very base level, I suppose, for me, what it is about is grassroots democratic management of society and production, that therefore, as part of that, prioritizes human need over profit. And if you want nothing else, that, I suppose, would be my very baseline.
Why is it that every time you talk about being a communist, I'm not just talking about you, I'm talking about the kind of, grander you're made to feel like a dog that has defecated on a prized family rug?
Yeah. Well, you're very used to this, being one of the poster children for being a communist publicly. We can make jokes about it, but it is actually really depressing because I would be tempted to say that there's two baseline answers. For years, one of the key answers was Stalinism and the situation of Stalinism. And that, I think, was a real issue and something to be taken seriously. And of course, the right wing always essentially acted as if the left wasn't engaging with this issue, which was bad faith bullshit. But it was nonetheless, when you have this enormous global power that is saying we are communists and that is doing things that most of us would not be supporting, and that I think has nothing to do with democratic grassroots management of production and society, then it's not surprising, to be generous, that people are immediately anxious about the term. Now, what's interesting to me now is that in the decades since the collapse of official communism, if you like, among a lot of people, and I do think this is not quite as bad as it used to be, but nonetheless, among a lot of people, one still has a lot of that kind of knee-jerk thing. And I don't quite know why it is. And I think part of it is, I think it's a conglomeration of various things. I think it's the kind of effects of, what Mark Fisher called capitalist realism, and this sense that, even if that would be lovely, it's just prima facie ridiculous. Why are we even talking about it? And then on the kind of, as you go further right, it would be nice to think that people are so dismissive about it because it's a threat. Actually, I think a lot of people are dismissive about it because it's just, as I say, prima facie absurd. And one of the things that's depressing about that to me is the lack of intellectual curiosity, if nothing else. People think that I'm saying this as a provocation. Totally sincerely, I would relish a good faith, serious debate with an interested right-wing interlocutor, a conservative who's taking these ideas seriously, taking ideas tout court seriously. But I think it's a combination nowadays of many, many years of accreted political attacks because we live in a right-wing culture, which obviously has a kind of has an instrumentalism for the ruling elite, but also just a kind of complete degradation of kind of political culture where a lot of people who should know better are just not even interested in this in the abstract. So I find that lack of curiosity really depressing.
Well, not to maybe repeat some of the more nightmarish interactions you've had with it, but how do you separate the ideas of communism which you've just espoused, which is grassroots democratic management of all the things that we need to survive, it tends to be how I phrase it, from its actual imposition in the Soviet Union or in China or in Cuba or North Korea. How do you achieve that separation, or is it even desirable to do so?
Well, I mean, yes, I think it is desire. I think it's very important. And as I sort of say in passing in the book, there are literally decades of really thoughtful discussion on the left about this. And again, in terms of the intellectual lack of curiosity, when right-wingers say, well, go back to Russia, go back to North Korea, I sort of think, I can't make you a communist, but as a matter of intellectual integrity, you should at least be interested in the fact that there's been a debate about this among your opponents for years. I mean, the book is primarily concerned with the manifesto itself, so I'm not going to pretend that I go into detail on this. But certainly, I think, the failure of the Russian Revolution, ultimately the failure because it's kind of encircled, and the failure of the German Revolution, and the fact ultimately, I think that these polities, whatever their intentions, whatever their aspirations, are competing, certainly materially, but also in various other spheres, on what is a kind of hegemonically capitalist world system.
So what's hegemonically mean, maybe for someone who is not familiar with the word?
The fact that they're competing in a capitalist world system means, I think, that they are subject to these kind of pressures of competitive accumulation, in which ultimately, whether or not it's thought of in terms of profit, is achieving the same kind of thing, where you have to have a kind of management that is absolutely not prioritizing human need.
You've got to put people and resources through the meat grinder of production. Right.
And I'm here bracketing a lot of debates about, what exactly was the Soviet Union and so on. Not because I don't think they're interesting. I think they're fascinating, but because that's not the prime issue here. And so I think, and then we can go further down and talk about the specific nature of the politics of the Western communist parties and so on. But as a baseline, I think because any aspiration for that kind of democratic management has been encircled by a system that would not allow it even to experiment, let alone to flourish and flower. So for me, that is the base of a lot of the issues in the notionally communist countries.
So let's turn to the manifesto itself, because right in the beginning, you talk about every political generation having to encounter it anew. What was your first encounter with the Communist Manifesto, and what was the political moment that you were a part of at that time?
Honestly, I should come up with a better story about my own encounter, because my first encounter with the manifesto was not particularly it wasn't particularly kind of bolt from the blue or anything. I was just, I was at university in the early 90s, the very early 90s, and I was reading lots of stuff, and I was on the left, but not, I would say now, not on the kind of the Marxist left, and was reading it with kind of as much of an open mind as possible. I would be lying if I said that it had hit me like a thunderbolt. The one exception to that is there's a part early in the kind of extensive second section where the authors suddenly start addressing the bourgeoisie. And they say, you accuse us of wanting to get rid of your property. That is exactly right. And I found that really amazing. I still get goosebumps thinking about that moment. So that line really hit with me. But taking it seriously as not that I thought it was a frippery, but sort of really relating to it as not just an important document, but a document that still contains really powerful analyses and so on. That came later, after many years of engagement with the left.
I think you talk in this book about the swagger of the Communist Manifesto. And I remember reading it, I was 14, and two things had happened. One was my mom had gotten me to read Black Skins, White Masks. And so there are all of these Marxist terms and I didn't know what they meant. So I thought, okay, got to go back and read the OG. And then the second thing was that I really wanted the boy who worked in the bookshop to fancy me. And so I thought that if I lurked around like the political philosophy shelves, that maybe he would be hit like a bolt from the blue. Unfortunately, it never happened. But then I opened it, and it was not the book I expected. I thought it would be something which I would have to work hard to feel grabbed by. And then suddenly it's this kind of like, I don't know, it felt like when you're listening to like Nas do Ether for the first time, there is something muscular and swaggering and unapologetic about it. How essential is thinking about mood and vibe when you're reading this text?
I mean, let me ask you, did you kind of come away from that initial reading like having gone to your first good rap concert and being like, that's it, I'm in? Or did it sort of percolate over the years a bit more?
I think it was two things. One is yes, because I definitely read it and I was like, bars. And then I encountered it again at university in the context of a literature degree.
Right.
And suddenly you know why it's working on you in the way that it is.
Right. Well, I think that's really important. And I think that's one of the things, I'm really glad you've raised this, because I think what doesn't get talked about nearly enough is precisely the manifesto as literature and as a manifesto, which is a whole literary form, which I try and talk about a bit. And there's a danger of this, because there's a danger that if you talk about this, it becomes a kind of domestication and a depoliticization. And it's sort of like, this week we're doing Southey and Wordsworth, next week we're doing, not that I have anything against Southey or Wordsworth, but I think it is really important to relate to this political tract, which is what it is, as also a piece of literature of a particular genre and form that works the way it does, because it is great literature of a particular genre and form. And therefore, for its kind of literary form and its political arguments, I think, are inextricable. And I think that swagger that you're talking about, particularly, I think, in that section, is intoxicating. And some people are very skeptical about this, and they talk about it as kind of, rhetoric, as if he's kind of, sort of brainwashing people. And I think that's quite wrong. I think that's very sort of unsophisticated reading of the way rhetoric works. And conversely, a lot of the critics, including on the left, and I should say also some of the partisans on the left, read it sort of bracketing all these issues of language and stuff and treat it almost like a kind of history textbook or something, which I also think leads to misreadings. So one of the key things I would really like to do is say, whether you end up, impressed by it or not, whether you end up agreeing with it or not, read it with the kind of rigorous critical generosity that befits any text, and particularly any literary text,
So what is the difference between like a manifesto and a treatise? What is this text doing that other texts maybe weren't?
Well, I mean, I suppose we have to do a caveat, which is to say that there's no sharp lines between literary forms. So, I don't think any text operates like maths. They all have a certain degree of of ambiguity and ambivalence and playfulness and so on. But I think manifestos in general, they have a whole chapter about this. They revel in a certain kind of playfulness, a certain kind of swagger, partly enjoying the language as a sort of performance. They're highly performative, but it's also a performance that attempts to do something in the world. So, for example, I can give you an example. So when Marx and Engels say the working class has no country, now there's a right-wing attack on this, which is to say, well, clearly loads of working class people do associate with their country, so the manifesto is wrong. Bang. And then there's a kind of very, this is much less of a big problem, I should say, but there is a sort of reductive left thing, which is to say, so see, all we need to do is just not worry about nationalism because we don't have a country. It's like, no, that partly what that is that prophecy? Is that exhortation? Is that critique? Partly, I think, along with various other scholars, that Marx and Engels are saying this precisely because there is nationalism among the working class. And they're saying, stop this, and then you can still say, as I would, that they underestimate the power of nationalism among the working class. But the fact that sentence can't be read as a straightforward truth claim, it's a performative intervention. And that doesn't mean whitewashing or sort of, giving them carte blanche for saying anything. You can still say this is wrong, this doesn't work, etc., etc. But if you don't sort of approach the text with, as I say, a kind of sort of ruthless but comradely generosity about what it actually is, how it's doing these things, then even if you're a critic, surely you want to criticize your opponents at their strongest, not their weakest. So that, for example, is one of the ways that I think a manifesto operates as a political argument that a textbook about political sociology wouldn't.
I mean, there are so many moments in this book where you are looking at particular phrases which are used in the Communist Manifesto, which have been taken as predictions, which then failed, and you're trying to go, okay, but actually, what is this? Is this a prediction, or is this something we want to happen? How much did you find yourself having to ventriloquize Marx and Engels and make a claim of knowing what they're thinking? And how did you do it? Was it simply all there in the language, or you drawing on other sources?
I think I have to draw on other sources to a degree. As far as possible, I make it as kind of focused on the manifesto itself. But I would want to tweak slightly your formulation, because the question of intent, it's not, what they actually intend it's not meaningless, and it's important, particularly when their intent is being misrepresented. But you're a literature student, what the author intends is only one part of the story. Mm-hmm. So there are certainly times, for example, when I might say, and also intent itself is very ambiguous. We can intend more than one thing at once. We can intend things that are contradictory. I never know my intentions until the wrong thing happens. Exactly. This is like this advice to writers, know your characters. I don't know myself. How am I supposed to, But in this case, so for example, there might be places where I would say, Marx and Engels, appear to be meaning this and thinking this. Whether or not they do, I'm going to say this is what the text itself is claiming, whether or not that's right. You know what I mean? But I don't want to say that what they actually mean is unimportant. Because I think there's a difference between being somewhat contradictory and being unimportant. So, when you talk about the question of inevitabilism, there are plenty of places where they talk in a kind of inevitabilist language that I think is ultimately unhelpful. But often, and I'm not going to sit here and say, yeah, but they didn't mean that. They didn't mean that. Partly because that's unfalsifiable. Partly because I have no idea what they meant and didn't mean. Partly because, as you say, like most of us, they probably mean more than one thing at once. What I am going to say is, if you read this book, the manifesto, rigorously and generously, but critically, the only conclusion you can come to is that they mean this, but they kind of also mean this. And therefore, while you may criticize this aspect of this other aspect is fairly persuasive and is not normally talked about, and so on. So I definitely don't see myself as wanting to be a ventriloquist. I want to be I want to be generous and comradely, but non-hagiographical and critical. I mean, one of the things that you say in this book, and it was one of those real moments where it suddenly connected different bits of my brain and synapses were firing, which hadn't before, is you draw a relationship between the Communist Manifesto and religious pamphleteering. And it suddenly made sense of a lot for me, particularly the language of apocalypse and almost like biblical revelation, like there is a set of events waiting in the wings and they will unfold. Do you think that people on the left have a religious relationship to the Communist Manifesto? And if they do, is that a helpful political mode in which to encounter the text? Well, I'm going to be really annoying and say it depends what you mean. But in my defense, I'm certainly not saying no, absolutely not. Mm-hmm. I think the idea that the Marx is a religious prophet and the manifesto is a religious text is often thrown around, usually by the right. And one of the things I'm trying to say in this, as you say, is rather than simply saying no, it's saying, well, according to a certain way of approaching religion, yeah, absolutely, this is a text about apocalypse. And I think I don't have a problem with. I'm fascinated with religion, both in its own terms. I'm fascinated and respectful towards, and learn a lot from religion, both in its own terms and as a kind of cultural and social phenomenon. And I think that for me, it's very hard to talk about the world at the moment without having a sense of the kind of lived reality of apocalypse. And famously, apocalypse, the rending of the veil. It's an uncovering as well as a catastrophe. And I think that I don't think there's any question that this is an apocalyptic text, and a text that is about, among other things, redemption and the end of the world and a new beginning and the kingdom of God, And there are so many texts which follow on, like Wretched of the Earth, which then really embrace that language of apocalypse. Yeah. So what is decolonization? It is no less than a program of total disorder. Right. And the word that I obsess about in this book that Engels in particular uses, but they both use, is rupture. This is about rupture. This is more or less an explicitly apocalyptic way of thinking of the world. And I'm really interested in the kind of the affective elements of politics. And I think that the model of politics that we have whereby, some people, particularly on the left, I would say, see, you've basically either got rational politics or you've got irrational politics. And I think that's a very stunted view of reality. And I think there's a whole third form that I would, after the writer Rudolf Otto, I would call the non-rational, or we think about as the affective and the aesthetic sort of bundled together. And this is, I don't think, irrational. And I think it's absolutely constitutive of being human. No less than these other two, but it is as well. And I think part of what you talk about in terms of the language and this kind of incredible rush of rhythm and the poetry of this is precisely about trying to tap into, this sense of catastrophe, and catastrophe because we are, living an ongoing catastrophe, even more so now than when it was written.
I mean, so say you're talking directly to, a 16, 17-year-old who, like me, is sort of lurking around the bookshelves, and maybe they don't have an idea of themselves as being a particularly critical or rigorous or interrogative or generous reader. What would you advise them in terms of how they encounter the Communist Manifesto?
I mean, in a way, obviously in this book, I'm focused very heavily on the manifesto because that's what the book's about. But in a way, I think I say at one point, it deserves to be read like any other text. Like, it's like, I don't think this is just advice about the manifesto. I would hope this is advice about all texts. All texts have unconsciouses. They have contradictions. They have bad spirits. They have guilt. They have what they say, what they really mean, what they don't want to mean, what they're upset, And I think what I would say is, every text should be read as far as possible, very unsentimentally, very ruthlessly, but also generously, go in to try and get as much out of it as you can, both for yourself, but also like if there are 5 different ways of interpreting a particular phrase and, 4 of them make the writer seem idiotic and 1 of them makes them seem, probably pretty smart, even if you don't agree, why not start by thinking that it's the one that makes them seem smart? That's a much more interesting way of reading.
But I would put it to you that when you're 16 or 17, you don't go into a text looking for the text's meaning. Yeah. You go in looking for yourself.
Yes.
And your own meaning, which is a different thing.
That's very true. And you're quite right. And I am talking about this as someone very old who's been reading, in a certain way as an adult for a long time. And I guess I would say, and I would hope that there's no contradiction ultimately. And that, of course, we all find ourselves and our ideal selves and what we want and so on in all the texts we read. And there is no one way to read a text. And so, if you read this text and you come away thinking just, the world is burning and I want to change it, great, fine, fantastic. But I don't think I think there are other things you can also do, which are also great. So, and I don't in any way want to suggest that that's not one of the most important things you can get out of the text. So yeah, I would hope that you can find both yourself and wider programs in reading. I
mean, just moving along a little bit, one of the things that struck me is what it ends with, right? Workers of the world unite. And right now it seems that worker isn't as central to our identities as woman or person of color or queer person. And of course, all of those things are really important, but it feels like in the age of like id-pocalypse now, it's just all like id-pol, that we don't think of ourselves as workers. So why has that become so distanced from how we perceive ourselves?
Well, I suppose, this is a huge debate, and so I'm groping, and I don't want to seem glib like I have simple answers. But I think, for me, in a sense, it's a category error. I think to think of being a worker or being working class as an identity. That is precisely part of the problem. And I should say that I think there's no question that there are currents on the left that basically say, all that matters is what class you are and all this rest is frippery. And this has not helped things at all. And that kind of, what's sometimes called class first stuff is I think ultimately very unhelpful. But what I do think, and one of the things that I do argue is that, we have to, try and race class, we have to try and gender class and so on. But I don't want that to seem to be a kind of, add the buzzwords together and stir. Like it's an attempt to say there is something distinct about class, not because it's better, not because it's more important, but it's a different kind of relation to the ongoing making of the world. I shouldn't say different. I retract that. I would say distinct. That it is at the point of our production of, stuff, services, and in particular profit, that we actually kind of constantly remake the world. Now, those are absolutely not separated off from our identities, and those identities become constitutively part of that. But I do think that to suggest that there is something particular about one's place in the kind of capitalist economy as a wage laborer is not to denigrate the importance of other identities at all. And I'm very concerned about this kind of false dichotomy and this kind of dialogue of the deaf,
I guess I'm asking a question of how, which is, how do you take the relationship of you, the person, to capital, and you take it close to your heart? Because gender and race feel close to my heart, and I wish that I could take my relation to capital from this level of the cognitive and put it in this place of feeling and sensitivity and nerve endings and, a kind of more primitive impulse that I feel with the other stuff.
I think that's so interesting. And I think that the kind of lived affective reality of class, I think, has changed over generations. And when you read, for example, the testimonials of workers in Russia in 1917, it is very much a kind of an identity, which I would say is not, it is also a kind of structural position, but it is received at those sinews and nerve endings. I think that the fact that many of us don't feel that way, or I don't think is just a given. I think it's the result of a whole set of kind of history and politics and economics. Some of it quite a deliberate and conscious ideological ploy, precisely to kind of declass people, to eradicate class consciousness, and partly kind of thrown up by structures of the way capitalism has worked over the years. In terms of how people can relate to it, I suppose I don't think that one can experience things in the blood by fiat. I don't think you can just say, right, today I shall wake up and feel like a worker. I think what you can do is two things. One is to kind of try and, again, with a sort of generous rigor, sort of understand what class actually means in these debates and in this text, and then sort of try and locate oneself intellectually. But there is also a kind of a negative way in, which is, I think, I quote Asad Haider in this book, and I think his work is brilliant. And one of the things he says, which is a kind of inverted way of relating to your thing, is, if you don't think in terms of class, like a lot of his students who he talks to, who talk very much about these other identities and experience life as these other identities. And he says one of the simple things he says to them is, at the moment, roughly, say 1% of the world controls 90% of the resources. Would the world be fixed if the 1% who included the 19% of resources were, so many percent queer, so many percent black, but we still had that bifurcation of access to resources and power, because that would be to sort of have, a ruling class that was a genuine rainbow nation of, and I think that as a thought experiment, the idea that you do that, but somehow the world is fixed, is self-evidently false. And so essentially there has to be something about the particular shape of kind of power stratification and resource stratification in our world, that even if you don't experience it in your blood and bones, which is itself important and interesting, is constitutive of our reality and that needs to be got rid of.
I mean, you talked about society and politics becoming declassed, but isn't there also an aspect to which gender and race got declassed as well? Because
totally,
I sort of encounter, like, particularly people who were my students, right? So that generation below me, and they're talking about things like microaggressions, and I'm like, please, like, there's a reason there's the word micro in it, and there could be a world where everyone pronounces my name correctly, and I don't think that would stop the fact that Bangladesh is drowning.
Right. That's beautifully put. I mean, for someone from a different political generation from you, I will say that I really hate a certain type of anti-woke, in inverted commas, I say that with heavy inverted commas, leftist approach to this. And I can only say that for myself, learning some of the terminology like microaggressions and stuff has been absolutely epiphanic, hugely important to me, which isn't to say that I don't think, as, Olufemi Taiwo is talking at the moment, that this can't then be very simply captured and turned around. That doesn't mean that there's a problem with the terminology or with that way of looking at the world per se. It's like, what is done with it, who's using it, who's in power of it, and so on. And I think, so I think you're right. I mean, if you think about racing class and gendering class, but also thinking of race and gender and other identities as always already classed in one way or the other, that is also going to enrich the way you experience those, I think, and that you understand those. And I think that there's a paradox here, which is some of the kind of class, in inverted commas, class first leftists who won't be having with any of this, id poll nonsense. I think what they end up doing is having a totally unstructural, totally unsystematic, purely identitarian notion of class.
Oh, hugely, because if you know what a cortado is, then you can't be working class.
Right. So you saw this a lot with some of the kind of, and let's bracket the idea that there are the truth that there are, really interesting and serious debates to be had about Brexit, and like it's not a straightforward issue for the left. I think that was true. Nonetheless, what you now get on a lot of the kind of pro-Brexit left, I'm not saying all, but is this kind of, the horny-handed sons and daughters of toil, wanted Brexit, whereas these effete Shoreditch people who drink, lattes and nutmeg whatnot, so therefore, like, you got the working class want Brexit, and it's like the idea that or someone, Michael Portillo said to me the other day that, when I was doing an interview with him, that wasn't a name drop, sorry.
You know what? If you're going to name drop anybody, Michael Portillo wouldn't be it.
Fair enough. He said to me, Jeff Bezos, I can't remember the exact formulation he was using, but essentially, like, everyone goes on foreign holidays and likes the same kind of coffee. And it's like this idea that, because you have a certain set of cultural bump that appeals to you, you are or aren't working class. That's the right wing version. The left wing version is, the horny-handed, mushy peas eaters, are the working class, and the Shoreditch kids are not. And the
existence
bullshit
of Tottenham suddenly just like gets nuked off of the face of the political map.
It's really insulting, and it's really sociologically dunderheaded, and it leaves aside, a lot of the discussions around gentrification, which is, of course, a real and really serious social evil, are actually, revolve around a kind of workerist identitarianism, where it's kind of like, look, this kid may I'm sorry I keep saying kid, but I feel this startup worker may very well like nutmeg in her latte, but you know what, she's on minimum wage, she's couch surfing, if she loses her job, she's homeless within a month, she can't afford, etc., etc., etc. The idea that somehow she's bourgeois or even middle class because she likes nutmeg in her coffee is it's historically it's totally ahistorical, and it has exactly the kind of identitarian politics that they would denounce in others. It does not take class seriously, which is interesting because that's, of course, what they think they are doing seriously.
I mean, I'm trying to deal with this question at the moment in my own work, which is, what is the relationship between class and identity?
Yeah.
And do you need class to have an identity in order to make people feel the thing? And if so, what does that identity look like? How do you have class as something that we all see ourselves in, while retaining a level of cultural distinctiveness and variety?
I mean, I don't know. I would think you know this much more than me, and I'd be really interested
I only just shaped the question. I don't know the answer.
I mean, I'm not opposed at all to sort of having a kind of cultural identification to class in certain contexts, like the communist parties for example, in Britain, and in the States, for all their towing of a line that I think was pretty catastrophic, some of their kind of cultural organizations, I thought were, really interesting, and do indeed say, among the ways in which you can experience the world at this affective level is partly as part of a class collective and so on. And I think given that we are, affective animals, we will always be sort of relating to identity on some form or other. And I have no particular problem with saying that one of the ways that could be, particularly if it leads into a kind of politics of being in a class for itself, is partly around class. I do think it's a category error to relate to it as if it's kind of bred in the bone or as if it's, essentialized or whatever. And I also think it's important to stress that, ultimately, I have no objection if that's one of the things that helps people live in the world and indeed be political. But I also don't think that therefore, as long as you are relating to the world politically and radically and in terms of, rupture, I don't think therefore you can't do that if that's not a way of identifying that appeals to you.
When you use the word affect, what do you mean? Because I use affect and vibe ultimately interchangeably.
Yeah.
Because like a vibe, you kind of know it when you feel it.
Well, obviously, I can't use the word vibe because it would be like a high court judge or something. It would be like asking who the Beatles are. Like, it would just be embarrassing for everyone. But as I understand from your formulation, I think what is a vibe? I think I agree with you. I think it's related for me. There's something about intuition. I'm very interested in intuition, and the problem with intuition is that it's sometimes wrong. It's often wrong.
Well, I've never experienced that.
Well, interestingly, I think one of the really interesting things about intuition is that it's often right. And the problem is, if someone says, well, there's nothing to intuition because it's often wrong, then you're basically pathologizing all of the kind of the rightness. And I'm not it would be very foolish to just like safely trust your intuition. But intuition is always, if nothing else, a datum. It's always something to be learned from. And I think in this context, a lot of this kind of questions of identity, questions of lived experience, questions of vibe are indeed, you kind of know it when you feel it. And it would be very difficult to write it down in kind of mathematical formula. The vibe in this room was X because Y is Z, but of the 100 people who were in there, 85 would go, yeah, that was definitely the vibe. And that's not nothing. That's important,
And do you think that this is where art comes into politics and trying to create affect or tap into it or demonstrate an understanding? Because there are lots of things that I've read where I'm like, I know I'm supposed to like this. Yeah. Right? It's hitting the notes, but I don't vibe with it. There is some texture or some taste or something which is kind of in the world of the senses and the physical body for me, which just isn't working. Yeah.
I'm very interested in the unsayable. I'm very interested in that which is beyond language. And it feels to me like most of the stuff that we love, particularly when it comes to art and so on, we can explain, I don't know, 80% of what we love about it. But there's always going to be a bit that we're just like, and then this, because people say, well, all those elements are also in this other piece. Why don't you like that as much? And it's like, because vibe, because, and conversely, as you say, there are plenty of, I watch a lot of like science fiction films or whatever, and I'm like, I am so a shoo-in for this. So why is this leaving me so cold? I do think, and this goes back to bring it right back to that question I was saying about the kind of the non-rational, if your theory of the human consciousness, of human agency is that you've got the rational and you've got the irrational, where's all this? Where's your favorite art? Where are your problematic faves in this? Where are the faves that should be faves but aren't? And the idea that stuff, the stuff you're talking about, is somehow epiphenomenal to being human, somehow not that important, just seems to me to be a deeply impoverished and wrong theory of what being human is,
So why for you was the novel a way for you to interrogate other worlds you can build or other political structures or the way things could be or shouldn't be? Why not something like drama, which is, of course, what Brecht turns to as a communist writer? What was it about the novel?
The truth is I don't know. But I'm fine with that, according to the sort of paradigm we're outlaying. But I think I should also say that although I am very much interested in those questions, and anyone who does anything creative at any level, the things they're interested in are going to be in their stuff, among various other things, it very much was not a political intervention for me to write the novels. That's not what it's about. And I know you're not quite saying that, but, I think someone like Brecht, in a much more direct way, it's like, this is a political intervention. I'm going to do it in the form of a drama.
Brecht stages Antigone because he wants it to hold a mirror up to Nazi Germany. Right. That's what he wants to do.
And I would say, in terms of like how we judge art, Because one of the problems I have at the moment is I feel like a lot of the discussion about art, particularly on the left, is essentially politics by proxy and predicated on category error.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like, what do you mean? If what you mean is I'm going to create this, you, Brecht, I'm talking to Brecht now, I'm going to make this amazing piece of work and it's going to hold up the mirror, then sure, we can judge that and we can say this is a really great success or not, If what you mean is I'm going to mobilize the masses, then we have to say Brecht's been an abject failure. There are most of the people who go and see Brecht plays and love them are not, then building the barricades. This is not a criticism of Brecht. This is about saying, what are the categories of what these things are? So for me, I love fiction. I love reading, fiction and fiction about certain things and so on. Therefore I really wanted to do it. And as someone who has a political view of the world, among the various things that are going to be thrown into the rag bag of the books is that political view of the world. But if I want to make a political argument, I will write, I will write something that is a political argument. And I would make this is absolutely not an argument for saying, well, art's just art. And, I'm very pro, political readings of art, critical political readings, debating the kind of multifarious meanings of these things and so on. But I am very, very wary of the idea of doing politics through doing art. And I'm wary of it partly because I think it doesn't work, partly because I think it's a category error about what art is, and partly because, in my experience, it very, very often segues into, to my mind, a really disgusting kind of artistic exceptionalism among artists. We are the real activists. We are the cultural memory of a people, And it's unbearable and it's elitist and it's disrespectful. I think bakers and plumbers can be cultural memories just as much as we can and so on. So,
but everyone likes to lend obscene status to the thing they happen to do.
See, I don't know that that's true. I think people who work in the cultural field do. And, I love a book. I love a film. I love an album. I'm not saying these things are not good, but I'm not convinced. I think there's a difference between saying, I'm a baker and I'm going to be a fucking great baker, and saying, as bakers, we are the true historians and activists. And I don't know that people do that.
No, but if you talk to a baker about food,
right,
and they say what food does, food transcends language.
Well, maybe, yeah.
Right? When something tastes good. Or people tell a story of themselves, which is, you might walk over me and think I'm not important, but really my thing is the thing. And actually thinking of ourselves as a social organism. Right. Of everyone doing the things which make us human as a totality.
Well, I'll take that. That's a really good point. And maybe the problem then is that where, a civil engineer and a dinner worker and a waiter and so on might do that, unlike the work they do, for a whole bundle of reasons to do with commodified culture and so on, the work that cultural producers do is validated in a way that theirs isn't, largely grotesquely. And and again, I say this not at all to criticize cultural production, but when I think if a plumber says, I am the true memory of an oppressed people, most people would consider that ridiculous hubris. Whereas if a writer or an artist says it, at least a reasonable number of people will say, that's so true, that's so true. And I just think it isn't necessarily,
I just wonder if it's because you've got the people in charge of cultural production talking about the importance of their own cultural production, and then it's published. So you kind of get a cheat code for amplifying your own self-aggrandizement.
I think that I completely agree with you. I would only add to that those cheat codes, they're not hermetically sealed. They do also then kind of reverberate throughout culture and so on. So this is a long-winded way of answering your question, but I don't, I write novels because I really love novels and I like writing them. But I didn't. And then after the fact, I can then start coming up with all kinds of, I hope, interesting theories about the relationship of different art forms, including the novel, to bourgeois society and to capitalism and so on and so forth. But it is very much a question of the theory following the fact rather than, setting out programmatically.
I mean, so let's get into that next question, because you have said that you want to write a book in every genre. And I want to know, am I going to get like a drawing room novel, right? You know the way Jane Austen novels are just about people going to each other's houses? Like, am I going to get a domestic novel? Because I kind of want one.
I mean, I should say, you say, you have said, I did say that 20 years ago, and like, okay, fine, I said it, I'll take it, like, I'm not gonna complain about that, nothing is ever forgotten.
But I refuse to be held hostage by my past self who knew nothing.
Exactly, especially because my past self said it in passing. We talk about swagger, like, like that was a great little swaggery line. The kernel of truth in it is I'm really interested in genre as an engine, and different genres as different engines. The answer to your question is almost certainly no, because as a writer in particular, and to a lesser extent as a reader, the engine of the kind of domestic, I don't know what you want to call it, the domestic novel, does not particularly fire me up. And I'm being very carefully non-sectarian here, because I don't want to suggest that there are no great novels of this kind, or that I never read them or so on. But what I can say is that I can say two things. I can say with certitude, they don't particularly interest me as a writer. And then I can say slightly more cautiously that I think you could start to have an interesting conversation about their limitations in terms of the kind of aesthetic and political nexus in senescent capitalism and so on. But I would
what's senescent mean?
Falling apart. Capitalism in a growing catastrophic crisis. And I think that, I think to put it very crudely, my suspicion, my feeling is that what you could broadly call the kind of liberal novel has been in a fairly parlous state for a fair old while. And I'm certainly not going to say that there are no exceptions to that, but I think I probably would cautiously say I suspect that is not coincidence. And I suspect that one could start to draw certain analytical reasons as to why that might be.
I mean, the thing about engines is that you can hijack them.
Right. Yes.
And I suppose I'm interested in, do certain genres do certain things and you might hijack them, but you can't do the other thing very well. So there's a reason why there are so many communists and leftists who are interested in speculative fiction and sci-fi, because that is a means by which you imagine a world which isn't here. And there is a reason why conservatives of both the big and the small C variety love a marriage novel. And it's because it's about social reproduction and the continuation of the thing that came before, essentially. Is there a way in which genre resists our hijacking?
I think I would. You can tell I'm being very tentative and cautious about this, and it's not because I'm trying not to.
I'm not trying to get you to like beef Sally Rooney, by the way.
I'm fascinated by Sally Rooney, and I really respect Sally Rooney as someone who, her work is not my kind of thing, and I read it with great sort of respectful interest. It's not my milieu, but I read it with great respectful interest, not least because she seems to me to be someone wrestling with exactly this kind of problem. And also someone who is very open to the idea of like, maybe this is on a hiding to nothing, but the best thing we can do is to do a kind of Beckett thing and fail better. And I think that's great. I think I am very cautious of the kind of special pleading that can follow the kind of argument that you're making about like, and again, I know that you're not saying this, but some people
might be though.
Well, science fiction is, the radical genre. It's like, this is absolute fucking twaddle, or like, all drawing room comedies are, just deeply and inherently reactionary. It's like, it's just nonsense. I think I would take a sort of tentative soft version of what you're saying. I think that the way, you're talking about hacking engines, I think it is true that certain engines have a kind of elective affinity to certain kinds of jobs. So it is really interesting to me that so many people who are interested in sort of sociological views of the world, write crime novels. And crime has a very particular kind of political iteration because of the way you have to experience the world through a crime novel. I think it's definitely also, at a kind of one can gesture to the fact that a lot of leftists are very interested in science fiction and so on, and say, well, there may well be something there, but I would want to caution about A, any kind of sweeping statements, and B, what sometimes follows from that observation, because you can accept the observation, but then what can sometimes follow from it is like, therefore, socialists should be into science fiction, or science fiction is inherently radical, or whatever. And I just think that's just absolute nonsense. So I think, in a way, to the extent that what you're talking about is a kind of very general sort of sociological tendencies, I would say, yeah, there's something to be investigated here. But when I start to see people talk about deploying science, which a lot of people do in totally good faith, deploying science fiction for social activism, I was like, I think this is a mistake. I think it's a category error. Now, if this helps you get up in the morning, if this helps you get through your day, if this is one of the ways you want to be a radical, knock yourself out. I don't stand in the way of that at all, and I wish you love and luck. But if what you think is, this is the way to be an activist, and this is the way to bring people into, I just think this is a category error.
I suppose one of the reasons why I'm interested in this is deeply personal, and it's to do with what I feel the domestic novel has done, which is have this laser focus, and it's claustrophobic. It is socially claustrophobic, and it resembles a world that I live in. Right. And it makes me think about, so how do you produce social change within extremely constrained circumstances? And sometimes I read sci-fi and I go, but this is the cheat code. You just got there, and it's radically different. Yeah. So I guess I want to talk about the relationship between ideas and dreaming and social change. Do you nurture the impulse to dream and formulate something that is radically altered because that helps you get to this world that you want? Or is there something about this horrible, suffocating drawing room where women have to get married, otherwise they're destitute, because that is telling you something about where you are and the jail you have to break out of?
Yes.
Oh, it's not really an either or question. I was just talking about my feelings.
I know, but this is why one can answer this on a kind of individual level. Yes, I find it really interesting to read Ursula Le Guin, and it makes me think about different models of gender and so on and so forth. But I can also tell you, for a matter of fact, that plenty of deeply intelligent, deeply reactionary people think Ursula Le Guin is a genius and know perfectly well what her politics are, and are interested in the gender politics in the books, but it doesn't make them radicals. And I think part of the problem with this, sorry, I'm kind of buzzing all over the place.
Go for it.
One of the problems with again, I don't say you're saying this. One of the problems with the way this
but I might be saying something dumb, and I am very open to that possibility.
I think this thing about politics by proxy, I think you're being very careful, but I think some people aren't so careful. And I think one of the problems with the sort of politics by proxy approach to art is the idea that any piece of cultural production, any piece of art, is essentially that you can decode it politically. And at its crudest, you say, well, this is what it means, and it's progressive, or this is what it means, and it's reactionary. And it's like I think everything basically, but certainly art, which is not reducible to a series of formula, is always contradictory. And it doesn't mean it's always going to be equally contradictory. It doesn't mean that you can never draw conclusions. But, if you say, and again, I know you're not saying this. If you say, there is a problem with the domestic novel, which is that it has this completely hermetically sealed everyday life, and there's no sense of alternative. But then, therefore it's reactionary. But then you can come along and say, what some of the best domestic novels, what they do is show how, in the incredibly constrained gendered reality, actually these kind of enormous psychodramas play out in ways that are it's not quite a normal domestic novel, but I think about, Clarice Lispector's work, some of them. This kind of visionary explosion of the sublime taking place, and at the entrance to a kitchen, or the entrance to a bedroom. So it can pull both ways. Similarly, I'm hugely resistant to the idea that in any kind of programmatic way, science fiction is useful to the progressive because it allows you to think about what alternative worlds would be like. Because I think the moment we start thinking about our depicted utopias as blueprints, we're on a desperate hiding to nothing. I think that's really a bad way of approaching it. But in the sense that there is something about the idea of not taking really existing reality as an immutable fact. Yeah, there is certainly something about that which can be speculative, which can be kind of imaginatively exciting, and I don't think it's a coincidence that dovetails with a lot of radicals.
So I finished reading Embassy Town a few weeks ago, and I'm really mad at you, by the way, for what you did to my Good Sis Rooftop. I was just like, oh, I'm now crying over this like insect alien thing, which shares no real coordinates with me. And I was really, really mad at you for that.
Oh, my work here is done.
Oh, I was just like, you did her dirty. You did Rooftops so dirty.
It's a cruel world, Ash.
No, you're a cruel man. You're a cruel man. But one of the things that it really got me thinking about is how we imagine difference. And here I'm not just talking about the different world. I'm really talking about encountering the other.
Yeah.
And how can you make an other so different from us, and yet we feel this pull, this sense of affinity and closeness and shared experience that I am crying over an insect alien thing, and it's not just because I'm at a certain spoke in my hormonal cycle. So could you maybe talk to me a little bit about that process of imagining difference for you? Because I don't know how you do it.
I mean, I think it's all a trick. And I mean that because I think it's definitionally impossible for a human being to imagine something genuinely non-human. I think definitionally you can't do that. Like, you're always thinking through your humanness. So what I think, and then you've got, like, if you want to talk artistically, you've got like things like Star Wars or Star Trek, which just kind of lean into this by basically, and I'm not saying this as a hater, like one of the ways to do this is just say basically all your aliens are people in rubber masks, but basically they're humans.
Or every planet you encounter is America.
Right. Okay. And, we can have our political critique of that, but like in terms of the representation of difference, it's essentially saying there is no difference. There's cultural difference, but there's no like ontological difference. There's no, and then you've got those books and films and so on, of which I hope Embassy Town is one, which try to say, okay, let's actually see how far we can get towards depicting something that is truly non-human. Now, for me, as I say, you will always fail because you literally can't. But, again, you can fail and then you can also fail better. So it seems to me that anything that does that kind of representation of the non-human, or I would even say in a certain sense, the non-existent, is going, the best it can do is fail better. And luckily for us, failing better can sometimes be absolutely wonderful. I think this has a really important political corollary, actually, and without making any claims about science fiction or whatever as a radical form, this is one of the reasons that I'm at base opposed to the idea of the depiction. It goes all the way back to this, opposed to the idea of saying we should have communism and this is what it'll look like, because it seems to me if you take seriously rupture, if you take seriously the idea that capitalism is a totality, capitalism conditions everything around us. It doesn't mean it's seamless, doesn't mean we can't fight it, but it is total. And one of the things we're trying to do, if we see it as a predatory, inhuman, monstrous system, which I do, is we're trying to break from it. And according to the program that I, critically defend in here, that necessitates a rupture. You can't reform it ultimately. You can make it better or worse, but you can't ultimately reform it. So you're creating a rupture. And the thing about a rupture is that a rupture will change not just, everything around us, but the us who perform the rupture. And you can't think about what a post-rupture world will be like with any rigor because we're not there. And so I'm all for like utopias and ideas and like maybe we do this, maybe we do this, maybe we do this. But I think that it is to disrespect the scale of the kind of psychic and spiritual and human rupture to say that we could predict what that would be like. All we need to do to proceed with it as a project is to say that there is a reasonable fighting chance that it would be less terrible than this fucking shit, but, and I'm all for thought experiments, but I'm heavily opposed to sort of blueprints and proposals.
So there's politics in fiction, which we've just talked about, but there's also fiction in politics. And that is something which is in the manifesto. So in some ways, the manifesto is this deeply Gothic text. And there are other ways in which fantasy and almost a kind of Tolkien legendarium inflects the green movement in some ways. There are all sorts of ways in which, sex positive writing, I think, is inflected by some of the tropes of pornography, right? You find fiction everywhere you look in politics. Is that a reason to be skeptical of some political text? Because actually that fiction is playing something of a trick on us and it's trying to take us towards like the bad utopia.
I mean, yes, I think your formulation of skeptical is probably right, in the sense that I kind of suspect that, as signifying monkeys, we're not going to be able to get rid of these things. And I don't want to. We are storytelling animals. Now, one of the things that one hears a lot is, about how great that is. And people talk about, the healing power of stories and so on. And this always seems to me to be a real hostage to fortune, because just because humans do tend to have a kind of narrative consciousness, whether or not you think it's transhistorical, doesn't follow in the slightest that that's a good thing. It may be neutral, or it may be a tragic fact of us that we constantly reduce things to narratives. So I'm not presuming that that's a good thing. What I am saying is that I think it is a thing, and we are where we are, and so the fact that we're going to kind of sort of lay narratives over our politics and so on, I think to a degree is inevitable. But I think skepticism and caution are probably about as good as we can do at sort of reading those narratives and being critical of them. You talk about some of the, some of the sort of Tolkien-esque narratives in some of the Green Movement or whatever. And I don't think that this, if we see certain types of narratives, I think it's perfectly legitimate to sort of say, an occulted logic here is this, and this is why I am uneasy with this. And are you even aware of this? I
mean, maybe could I invite you to explain that a bit more? Because for lots of people watching this, they're like, what's fucking wrong with Tolkien? I love Viggo Mortensen. What's the problem with saying that the land will be renewed once you get rid of the bad races?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I many years ago, I had a whole, I sort of went on record being very rude about Tolkien, and again, talking of kind of youthful swagger. Like, I'm not interested in doing that. There's plenty of stuff about it that I up to a point enjoy, and so on and so forth. But I think this is where a kind of political reading of texts comes in, so that if you, even if you really enjoy certain texts, like, you think Tolkien is a wonderful lyrical writer, whatever, then there is, it seems to me, a certain type of politics embedded in the depiction of, Hobbiton or whatever, and the idea of the Shire and this kind of thing. And
you don't get any Bangladeshi elves. This is what I worked out.
Well, except now you do in the TV series, and people are very unhappy, and the films, the depiction of the sort of vaguely disguised sort of Turks and I mean, and there's a certain kind of ostentatious Philistinism on the right when you say, or like the trade delegation in in the Star Wars movies that are like thinly veiled Japanese people, and you sort of say, well, this is obviously a riff on this, and they're like, what? They're aliens? What are you even talking about? And it's totally unconvincing. So I think to the extent that you're kind of engaging with and talking about those stories and saying, like, this is the way this is playing out politically. And sometimes, I'll give you an example. Like, one of the things that I really like is there is this notion that if you, so we're sort of conflating different categories here, but whatever.
Let's go for it.
All right. So there is this notion that, like, if you sort of, politically critique a story, you're just being this humorless killjoy and so on. And I mean, I have no problem being humorless killjoy, but it depends on the story that you're critiquing and so on.
Man, you have been hanging out with Richard Seymour.
As much as I can. But also, again, with this kind of learned and ostentatious Philistinism, because there is also a very honorable tradition of writers having these, semi-hidden stories pointed out to them and going, oh shit. So, now I know, for example, like if we talk about, Roald Dahl. Now, Roald Dahl, anti-Semite, no one is here to defend his position, on that. Okay, let me be very clear about that. What is also the case is that, the original depiction of the Oompa Loompas in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, these were, quote, pygmies. And then a delegation from, as I recall, the NAACP came to Roald Dahl and said, this is really racist and this is really problematic. And this is something that is, that all, our kids are reading, and it's, and he listened and he said, shit, point. So he changed them and he made them into little blue things or whatever they are. Now, if you kind of listen to the culture warriors, any notion of like, even reading narratives politically, let alone changing them, is like, to sort of piss on great culture and so on. And I'm really interested in, what about the writers who have, and artists and so on, who have these subtexts pointed out to them and who are troubled by it? And then I'm not saying it's their duty to change them. I mean, I can see an argument for people saying, well, actually, I'm going to stick with this, but I'm hearing you, whatever. Like bracket that. But, it wasn't her, but Enid Blyton's daughters, who were the kind of, protectors of her memory, and I'm not here to fly a flag for Enid Blyton, although I love her stuff.
Other than I'm part of the UDL, the Enid Defence League, paid up.
Well, I find it very moving that her daughters, who were hardly political radicals in, I think, the early 80s, took the gollywog out because they were like, Britain's changing and we don't like the idea of, of little kids of different backgrounds feeling like we're making fun of them. You never hear this in the stories of the Daily fucking Mail talking about, culture warriors, this and the other. And again, this is not to say this is what everyone should do. It is to say how nice it would be to have a non-deliberately stupid discussion about the politics of narratives.
In this country, you're dreaming. I mean, I want to sort of get into the problematic subtext because you have this interest in hybridity and monsters. And throughout literature, monsters and hybrids are a vehicle for something else. So there's the Franco Moretti reading of Dracula, where really you're talking about this kind of horrific, parasitic remain of feudalism that, industrialization should have gotten rid of. You've got ideas around succubi being women with horrendous sexual appetites. Yeah. So how do you write monsters in a way which consciously engages with some of these histories, but also puts some distance between it and maybe find something new? Or is the task of doing something new a stupid way to think about it?
No, I mean, I'm not the cops. I'm not here to tell people what they have to do. I can only say what, but I mean, it seems to me one thing is that, as I've said, I think, any text, any cultural figure is always going to be ambiguous and ambivalent. Ambivalent is probably a better phrase than ambiguous in the sense that, for every monster that includes a kind of a sort of horror of the dark-skinned other. That very self-same monster, sometimes in that same text, is kind of secretly admirable for the way it takes no shit. Is this racist or not? Yes, So again, I would caution against the reductive reading that this is bad and this is good. But I do absolutely feel that I think it is totally appropriate to sort of if you like, kind of check, don't just think, well, I'm writing about a succubus and I don't think women are sexual predators, ergo it's fine. When you sit in the chair, you're sitting there with culture with you. So maybe have a think about it. And I think a lot of people are doing exactly that. Now, at its worst, I suppose, artistically, that can then lead to the kind of text where in the anxiety to desperately get rid of any of that ambivalence and only have a good monster, it ends up with this very clunky text. Obviously not just science fiction or fantasy or whatever, the sort of, the desperate desire to do something that I think can't and shouldn't be done, which is to extract ambivalence from art. But at its best, what you certainly can do is say, we will, to put it very, very crudely, we will no longer have gollywogs in our kids' books. Because even if you want to make a case, as some people have, including some people of color, that are not stupid cases and that are interesting, that actually you can subvert the figure of the gollywog and you can make it a powerful figure, etc., etc., etc. 9 times out of 10, why don't we not? So yes, I think simply being aware. I mean, the only thing I can say is anytime you write anything, fiction, non-fiction, genre, non-genre, anything, poetry, whatever, you're not alone in the chair, even if you're alone in the room. The whole of fucking society and history is in there with you. And it's not a bad thing to just be aware of that. And that doesn't mean self-flagellating, but it just means, not taking these things for granted, that there aren't unconsciouses to the things that you yourself are bringing to the table.
So the newest innovation in art is supposed to be the NFT. And there was a utopian promise of blockchain. It was supposed to decentralize everything. Yeah. And suddenly all it's doing is just shifting money from late to early adopters. Why hasn't technology like blockchain actually heralded in a new era of creativity? Why am I looking at these ugly fucking monkeys all the time?
I mean, I think, culture, 99% of culture under capitalism is crap, right? And then of the 1% that isn't crap, it is, of course, riddled and riven with, contradictions and crap bits and so on and so forth. And I suppose to some extent, NFT is going to be like anything else. Like, I think it would be a hostage to fortune to say there are no interesting NFTs out there. I've never seen any, but I'm not going to sit here and say it doesn't exist. I think, I may be misunderstanding what you're saying, but my sense is that most of the innovations in form that come along through, through innovations in form, through innovations in technology, through innovations in infrastructure, will always throw up new forms of art and so on. And some of them will be interesting and some of them will be less interesting and so on. But I feel like, they are all overwhelmingly structured by the fact that they're existing within capitalism. And capitalism is, and I don't just say this as a kind of, swaggery sneer. I say it after, many, many decades of thoughtful, analysis and so on. And I say it in here, capitalism is a fucking disaster and an absolute, and a disaster for, among many other things, human creativity. So it would be asking a lot for, we poor, constrained people under this awful system that structurally always puts profit over any kind of human need, including creative human need, to do anything than find little glimmers of interstitial joy and creativity in anything we do. So in a sense, it's a fucking miracle any art is good, So I'm certainly not opposed to kind of formal innovations in, new ways of doing art. Some of them I'm skeptical of. Like, there's always a lot of excitement. I remember when the kind of non-linear hyperlink novel was a thing that people were very excited about, and I was never excited about it. And I thought, like, that doesn't appeal to me, and I will be surprised if it appeals to most people. And I think, broadly speaking, I was right, but I'm wrong about loads and loads of things. But in terms of like baseline quality, any kind of new art that comes along is going to come along in the context of all this shit. So how could it be other than constrained by that? Particularly, I think, in the context of something like NFTs, where it is so inextricable from the most vulgarian and crass notion of accumulation and profit. Like, I mean, not all relations to accumulation and profit are equal, and some are more unabashed, more unmediated, and more kind of Philistine-ly Promethean than others. And so it would be no surprise to me if NFTs were particularly shit artistically. I
mean, is the internet in some ways one of Mark Fisher's lost futures? It has this utopian promise, then Web 3.0 just delivers an even more unstable and extractive and speculative form of currency.
I'm out of my comfort zone here because I'm certainly not a Luddite, but I don't know much about blockchain. It doesn't interest me very much, but certainly, at a general level, I just think, you talk about lost futures and, paths not taken and so on. Like, this goes back to something we were talking about capitalism as a totality. Like, there is an enormous, if you like, to put it loosely, utopian potential in the internet. There's also a utopian potential in a hammer. There's utopian potential in clay. There's utopian potential in bread. Like, the utopian potential in all those things, which, when we're lucky, we see in a glimmer of creativity, or we see in, a beautiful political intervention or whatever. But they are, at a structural level, vastly less strong than the system in which they exist. So I think that's my way of saying yes about the internet, but no more or less so than lots of other things.
I suppose my last question is, why don't we want better for ourselves and for others? Why can't our love for our neighbours, our community, our species, the beings with whom we don't share a species category, why isn't that enough to make us do things?
I mean, this goes back to this question of consciousness for me, this model of consciousness that I'm constantly wrestling with, which has a strong pedigree on the left, this sort of ultra-rationalism. And I always want to be very careful to reiterate that I'm not defending irrationalism. I'm interested in tapping the non-rational. It feels to me like, one of the things, humans are very complicated animals and they're very contradictory animals. And as I
see you've met my mother.
Oh, I see you've met my mother. I see I've met everyone's mother and father and son and daughter and brother and sister. I feel like, we're all very contradictory. And the idea of, like, I think there is a, on the right, to put it very crudely, there is a kind of position on the right, which is that humans are fundamentally bad and they need to be, controlled, and they need to be, kept under the thumb, and they need to be, et cetera, et cetera. And then there is a position on the left, which is that humans are fundamentally good, and you get rid of all the shit and everything will be fine. Now, this is unfalsifiable. Who knows? I hope that the left position is good. But frankly, I think, as usually put, it's tremendously simplistic. It feels to me much more likely that humans are enormously protean. We are enormously changeable. We are enormously plastic. We are capable of the most wonderful and beautiful things and the most unspeakable depredations. And suggesting that one of those is more human or more really human than the other is simply absurd. And I don't think you can get at that with the idea of rationalism and irrationalism. I think that's always too crude. I think, I'm really interested in, like, this is where I think some psychoanalytical things can come in. It seems to me that anyone trying to make sense of, I would say probably capitalism forever, but certainly capitalism in the last few years, has to start accommodating the idea of structural sadism, structural masochism, and broadly speaking, what Freud called the death drive. Mm-hmm. If you try to kind of create a kind of rational, kind of capitalist accumulative argument for some of the kind of social phenomena we see today. Like what? Well, I think the surplus sadism we see in for example, some kind of extractive capital. I can give you an example. And I'm going back a bit deliberately because, when you see like Trump and he's like, really, like, the Democrats put kids in cages, but they don't want to talk about it. Trump says, put the kids in cages. Woo, woo, woo. So this is not a defense of the Democrats. It's about saying, the kind of performative sadism becomes part of the politics. But this doesn't start with Trump. It goes way back. And it's not only on the kind of Republican right, although I think they glory in it in a way that other political currents don't so much. I remember when Sarah Palin was standing, and there was an extraordinary thing where, like, she was saying, all these effete Democrats, they don't want to like drill for oil, but we know that we have to drill for oil. And then she started this chant of like, drill baby drill. Yeah. Now, to me, that was a real turning point in social sadism, because you can totally imagine a right winger in the 50s or the 60s or whatever. Again, not saying social sadism didn't exist back then, but different modulations, saying whether we like it or not, we have to drill for oil because we need it for our energy needs, and this is the rational thing for our country to do. But to make a kind of thinly veiled raping Gaia joke, deliberately to whip up a kind of violent group of people about like the glory in the sort of, I think, implied cruelty of this verb, was to me a kind of ostentatious sadism, which then got developed over the years into a much more extreme version. And I think this is inextricable from a kind of self-hatred and death drive and masochism. So you end up, which to be clear, capitalism hugely feeds into. This isn't just a kind of innate thing in history and humans are just terrible. But, Tad DeLay, who I draw on quite a lot in this book, who's a very brilliant sort of left psychoanalyst and so on, talks about people who are, on Medicare or Medicaid in the States and who will, eagerly vote against it, including, which will kill them, but on the sense that that's stopping someone else getting something. And this is both sadism and masochism completely inextricably.
I call that negative solidarity. It's the opposite of solidarity.
Exactly. And I think that we've always seen elements of this, and historically, of course, it was hugely pushed onto like non-white people and onto the kind of, the despised others of colonialism and so on. But it was never, those were never its only boundaries. And in a sense, this is now becoming I think much more openly diffuse and much more celebrated, and I think so. It's not a question of saying that humans are foul. It's a question of saying that humans are, enormously various and changeable, and that we live in a system which is particularly feeding those elements of negative solidarity and indeed sadism that I think are so catastrophic.
Answer this question how you want.
Okay.
It can be where you are right now or where you think the left should be in general, but it's not going to be one of your like, well, yes answers. I'm just ruling it out. What do you think is the most powerful motivator for people to seek out change? Is it love for the thing which could be different, or is it hatred for the thing that you have now?
I will answer this for myself, and I will say, I understand that, it might seem pusillanimous to like refuse to make a general answer about this, but I think it's really important not to make a general answer about this. I think different people are mobilized politically by different things, and I think that's great. And I think that what I want is a kind of large tendency of radicals and leftists who are motivated by all kinds of different things and who learn from each other's motivations and so on and so forth. For me, love and hate are inextricable. But one of the reasons that I end the book on a kind of rumination on hate, and one of the reasons I defend a certain kind of political hate, is partly because it is a deeply pathologized emotion, and one is given the sense that if one hates anything, one is doing something wrong politically and ethically. And
next stop murder,
right? And I strongly contest that. I contest that on the grounds that hate is inevitable for many of us, and that it is really unhelpful to pathologize inevitable emotions. And I would go further and say that for myself, I feel myself getting more. I've been political for many, many years, but I feel more and more political at the moment and over the last few years. And what for me has been a very radicalizing force is a kind of growing and glowing hatred for this system. So if someone is motivated to change the world out of love for what they want and for the people they love, as I am too, but if that's their prime motivation, I'm so delighted. If someone is motivated by anger, fine, by frustration, by, anything. But for me, the two things that motivate me more than anything politically. One is just hatred for the idea that this is as good as it gets, and for what this does. And the other is that emotion that the Germans call Sehnsucht, which is this kind of desperate yearning for something that you can't put into words. And for me, those two are inextricable, and then what keep me going.
China, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.